Hi everyone. In this presentation, I'm going to be talking about our recent work, Social Orientation, a New Feature for Dialogue Analysis. This work was presented at LREC Coling 2024 in Turin, Italy. My name is Todd Morrill, and I'm a PhD student in computer science at Columbia University. And on the slide, I've listed all of my collaborators for this work. So I'll start with the main idea of this work, which was to use social orientation features to help predict and explain the success or failure of dialogue outcomes. And so social orientation tags are essentially interaction style tags. So for instance, somebody could be warm, agreeable, or cold. Success is defined by conversations that are free from personal insult or attack. And so I think it's best to start with an example to illustrate the point here. So in this conversation, the conversation participants are discussing the decision to euthanize Harambe, which was a gorilla that was killed when a boy fell into its enclosure. So what we're going to do here is annotate the dialogue utterances with social orientation tags. And the first person advocates for a tranquilizer, and they maybe say this in an assured dominant manner. And then if you fast forward to the last person, they say that anybody that disagreed with the decision should be kicked out of the human group. So maybe this comes off as cold. And the question we're asking is, given the information that we have so far, is this conversation likely to succeed or fail? In other words, will there be like a personal attack that comes after this? And incidentally, this is predicted to fail at this point. So that's the setting that we're in. We're looking at dialogues and trying to understand, will they succeed or fail, and ideally explain why that happens. So I'll just quickly start with our contributions. So we release a new data set of dialogue utterances labeled with social orientation tags, and we also release our model that can predict these social orientation tags. On the right, you can see QR codes to all of our data and code assets. We achieve state-of-the-art performance on two English language dialogue outcome data sets using social orientation features. We replicate these results in a second language, namely Chinese, through a data set that we create. We also show that through the use of social orientation tags, you get a degree of explainability as to why conversations are succeeding or failing. And if you have relatively few labeled dialogue outcomes, you can still achieve a pretty strong classifier through the use of social orientation tags. So yeah, I'll step through the paper at this point. So just to kind of ground ourselves into some of the settings that might be interesting for this work, you can imagine any scenario where there's a conversation that's got a chance of success or failure, such as customer service interactions, business negotiations, diplomatic discussions, or online forums. In this work, we're very focused on Wikipedia page edit discussions, as well as the subreddit Change My View, where people post something like change my view about XYZ, and people go on to have a discussion about that. Sometimes these conversations succeed, sometimes they devolve into personal attacks. So again, we want to understand, will these conversations succeed or fail, and ideally be able to explain why that's happening. And we're turning to a theory from psychology, namely circumplex theory, to try to make predictions about which interaction styles are likely to succeed or fail. So take, for instance, somebody who's assured dominant. So these are the social orientation tags on the left. Somebody who's assured dominant might pair well in a conversation with somebody who's unassured submissive. But potentially two people who are assured dominant may butt heads, and that might not be a successful interaction. So we're looking to this theory to help it to give us those explanations. So yeah, at the start of this project, social orientation labels didn't exist for a huge corpus of dialogues, and so we went ahead and collected 30,000 labeled dialogue utterances And we use GPT-4 to do this. And on the left, you can see the label distribution. So warm, agreeable was very prevalent, and there's still reasonable support for most of the other social orientation tags. We had 3 human annotators look at about 400 of these dialogue utterances, resulting in an inter-annotator agreement score of about 0.42, so moderate agreement. And then if we looked at the agreement with GPT-4, it was more in the range of 20 to 30%, but a lot of the disagreements were occurring among neighboring tags, so cold versus arrogant calculating, for instance. And humans tended to use assured dominant more. But nevertheless, we want to just underscore that these tags showed utility in downstream modeling tasks, and we think that's the ultimate arbiter of the utility of these tags. So so just want to give a high-level overview of how we're making use of social orientation tags. So I guess this is more the data collection phase up top here, through to training a student model. So we take dialogue utterances from, say, conversations gone awry, and we feed those utterances to GPT-4, which spits back the social orientation labels. We then take this labeled data set of social orientation tags, dialogue utterances labeled with social orientation tags, and train a student model to be able to predict social orientation tags. This way we don't have to hit the GPT-4 API for any new document that we encounter. So that's what you see on the right. And once we're able to predict social orientation tags, the question is, how do you make use of these in downstream dialogue outcome prediction settings? And there are a few ways that we can create features. So one of the simplest ways is to just prepend the social orientation tag to a particular dialogue utterance. So you can see that with this warm, agreeable utterance. Another simple way to convert social orientation tags into a feature vector is to simply count the number of occurrences of each tag within a conversation. So talk a little bit about our experiment. So our experiment space has kind of like three spaces of decisions. On the left, we've got data sets, middle features, model, and then model decisions on the right. So the first 2 data sets are the English language data sets, the conversations gone awry data set, that's the Wikipedia data. And then the second one is Change My View, that's from Reddit. The third data set is a Chinese language Wikipedia style data set that we created. So again, these are page edit discussions in Chinese. From there, we can take these data sets and convert them into features. So on the simpler side of things, you could do something like TF-IDF. Something more complicated would be like social orientation tags. And so at this point, these features get fed to downstream models where we're predicting, dialogue outcomes. So on the simple side of things, something like logistic regression. Moving towards deep learning, you could use a Distilbert model, and maybe in the multilingual setting, you use XLMR. So I'll talk a little bit about our results now. So again, as I mentioned, we trained a student social orientation tagger, so we didn't have to use GPT-4 for all new documents. So we're getting 35% accuracy on this 8-way social orientation tagging task. It's primarily due to the fact that we're using a weighted loss function to get a greater variety of social orientation predictions. If you recall, there was pretty heavy class imbalance, and so without that you kind of get a little bit more concentration among those bigger classes, but without this loss weighting you can get easily 45% plus accuracy. And then if you look at the misclassifications, a lot of them tend to occur among neighboring tags. So you could look at cold versus arrogant calculating, for instance, and see some of the misclassification being explained away through that that lens. So now I'll point to kind of our headline result. This is one of our state-of-the-art performance results. So in this graph, you see the subset percentage of the training data set along the x-axis and test set accuracy along the y-axis. And this model is a Distilbert model that's using social orientation tags from GPT-4 in order to predict dialogue outcomes. Will they succeed or fail? And so this is on the Conversations Gone Awry data set, and we're achieving state-of-the-art performance here. So the next interesting question to ask is, what happens if you predict the social orientation tags instead of using the GPT-4 generated ones? And that's what you see in blue. Those are predicted social orientation tags. And then the next question is, how does that compare to not using social orientation tags at all? And that's what you see in orange. And so we were happy to see that there was a consistent lift in performance through the use of social orientation tags. And then the final result we'll highlight here is the low resource performance. So we found this very interesting result where if you use relatively few labeled dialogue outcome examples and you use social orientation features with a logistic regression model, you can achieve a pretty high performing classifier with relatively few data examples. So I just want to show that we replicated this result for the Change My View dataset, which was the Reddit portion of this dataset. So again, we trained a student social orientation tagger that was on Wikipedia data. So now we're in a second setting, namely Change My View, which is on Reddit, and we're saying, like, does this student tagger, this tagger for social orientation tags, does it continue to work in a second data set? And it turns out that it does. So if you look at this blue line, this is the setting where we're predicting social orientation tags. The orange line is where we're not using social orientation tags. So we still see there is a little performance increase through the use of social orientation tags. It's small, but it's but it was persistent. We also were able to replicate the low resource performance result. So we were pleased to see that. So I think one of the coolest things that we did in this work was to actually be able to say that the model is making predictions in accordance with circumplex theory, with this theory from psychology, and it's not like you can just obviously conclude that just if the predictions correlate with that theory. You have to be able to say that yes, the model is relying on these features. And so in order to be able to do that, we make interventions on the social orientation tags and observe the change in the model behavior. So in the middle of the slide, you can see an example where this is an utterance that's labeled as cold, and that's going to increase the chances of the conversation failing. And so the question is, if we swap in a more pleasant tag, does that increase the chances of the conversation succeeding? So you swap in unassuming, ingenuous, and you do this for all of the dialogues that have a cold utterance in them, for instance, and you measure the number of conversations that go from failing to succeeding, and vice versa. And what we see, take for instance in this second row here, is that if we do this intervention where you take negative tags and swap in more positive tags, the predicted outcome is more positive. And this allows us to conclude that the model is indeed relying on these features. And now we can start to explain the success or failure of an outcome relying on the theory. And so we thought this was a great win for explainability. Yeah, so just want to point out a limitation of this work. So one thing that we encountered when we were experimenting with a few other data sets is that a lot of data sets tend to have limited variability, both in the styles that are presented in the conversations. They tend to be, almost exclusively pleasant, or the outcomes are all success or all failure. And so we just want to point out that this social orientation features are likely to be most effective when there's some variability in the conversation and the outcomes. Just to conclude, we created a new data set of dialogue utterances labeled with social orientation tags. We showed how effective they can be for predicting dialogue outcomes, and we also show that this even confers a degree of explainability. So if you have any questions, feel free to email.